G'day guys, a big welcome back to the Anthology of Heroes podcast. In this podcast we share epic stories of figures and events that changed the course of history. And you've just tuned into part 2 of what has ended up as a 3-part series on the disastrous 1071 Battle of Manzikert. In our first episode we followed the reign of Emperor Constantine IX. Constantine's reign is particularly interesting because so much happened in it. You had the Normans in the west, the Seljuks in the east, Pechenegs in the Balkans, rebel generals, civil distress, inflation, and just to top things off, a major religious schism. There's a lot in there, and listening to that episode will help reveal why one battle turned out to be such a disaster for an empire that looked so robust on paper. In part 1 we spoke about the Seljuks briefly, but back then they were a peripheral annoyance to the Roman Empire. Here's where they really step into the spotlight. This episode we're heading to the desolate wastes of Turkmenistan to watch the rise of two brothers, Chaghri and Tughril, the founders of the Seljuk dynasty. After charting their rise, we're going to check back in with Byzantium because if you think things were bad under Constantine IX, well, you ain't seen nothing yet. After a string of rubbish emperors, we're going to follow the tragic reign of Roman Emperor Romanos IV, a man who, in a different time, could have been one of the greats. Finally, we're going to introduce Alp Arslan, the so-called heroic lion, a brilliant strategist whose achievements are still celebrated in many Islamic countries today. Specifically in this episode, we're going to cover the early history of the Seljuks, the rise of Tughril and Chaghri, Alp Arslan's raids into Anatolia, the worsening crisis in Byzantium, the policies of Nizam al-Mulk, Emperor Romanos' eastern campaigns, and the maneuvering that took place just before the Battle of Manzikert. Be sure to check out our Patreon page where you can listen to ad-free episodes early along with bonus episodes. Still here? Well, what are we waiting for? The 1071 Disaster at Manzikert, Part 2, Alp Arslan and the Seljuk Onslaught. It's sometime in May in the year 1038 AD. Citizens of the Iranian city of Nishapur tentatively unbar the gates of their city. Hands trembling, they pull back the iron clamps and stand in silence. Nishapur had once been a great Islamic city, a cultural hotspot famed for its refinement and learning, but that was centuries ago. The mighty caliphate that the Prophet had left behind had long since fractured into a patchwork of warring states, and Nishapur, like many other great Islamic cities, had become a prize to be fought over by petty warlords. And this latest group was the worst yet. Hideous, stunted savages who the aristocratic city dwellers considered barely human. The battered gates of the city shuttered open, and the conquerors brusquely pushed their way in. Plodding through the mud they came, one after the other. Perhaps a gasp rippled through the people of Nishapur as they cast judgmental looks upon their new masters. Clad in tattered clothing and streaked with mud, their distinctive features, slanted eyes, weathered bronze skin and thin, wispy beards, set them apart. Flecks of mud from their filthy rags splattered onto the spotless, colourful robes of the Nishapurians. So these were the notorious Seljuks. Men as wild as animals, hideous figures that fought like demons. Their horses dropped dung and their riders spat and laughed as they looked around the glowing city, their eyes gleaming as they dreamed of the treasure each building contained. The group suddenly fell silent and seemed to straighten in their saddles as two men, indistinct from the rest, dismounted and walked over to a table of food the Nishapurians had prepared in their honour. Wearing the same filthy clothing as the rest of their men, the only thing that gave them away as leaders was the air of respect the men seemed to have for them. They were brothers, and their names were Tughril and Chaghri. Approaching the table with the curiosity of wild creatures in a new habitat, they examined the delicacies that had been prepared for them. Tughril picked up a fist-sized pastry, sniffed it, took a bite, and reluctantly swallowed, before remarking to his brother, quote, "These noodles are good, but lack garlic." The pastry wasn't noodles, of course, but Tughril had never tasted anything like it before, so had no frame of reference. For the sake of their lives, the pompous Nishapurians stifled their laughter as the savages continually sampled their fancy foods. Uncivilized as these two brothers may have been, make no mistake, they were not fools. Tughril had firmly established his reputation as a military genius. His warriors had seen many remarkable victories owing to his command, But it would be his skills in statecraft that would leave the civilized world in shock. Soon thousands would swarm to his banners and he would transform his followers from a horde to an empire. The very same Nishapurians who sniggered at his primitive table manners would soon be begging for a place at his table. Just 2 years later, he would conquer all of Khorasan. In under 20 years, Baghdad. And 33 years later, his successor, Alp Arslan, would defeat the Roman Empire at the Battle of Manzikert, beginning a death spiral for the ancient superpower. So who were these Seljuks? Where did they come from? The Seljuk story begins in the 10th century, when a man named Seljuk left the service of the Khazars. The Khazars were a steppe confederacy, a loose group of tribes centered somewhere around the Crimean Peninsula, modern Ukraine. Seljuk had been a warrior in service of the Khazar chief, but the two had a falling out. We don't know what happened, but he had to leave. With his cattle warriors and family, Seljuk left and began the long journey to Jand, modern Kazakhstan. In his long caravan of men and animals, perhaps there were 2 children. Barely walking yet, these were Seljuk's grandsons, Tughril and Chaghri. Many of the Khazar elite adhered to the Jewish faith, so it's possible that Seljuk and his family were adherents to Judaism. If not, he would have been a follower of the traditional steppe religion, a kind of ancestor worship that revolved around the veneration of animal totems, particularly the grey wolf. But by this point, Islam was making inroads into Central Asia, and soon after arriving in Jand, Seljuk and his followers quickly embraced the religion of Muhammad. Most chieftains and khans on the outer steppe identified as Muslim, but their practices differed significantly from the Arabs or the Persians. The rough edges of steppe culture were very much visible under the blanket of their new religion. By the time old Seljuk passed away, at 107 years old according to legend, he'd managed to attract a core group of followers outside that of his immediate family. In fact, his influence had grown so much that bigger, badder war chiefs grew concerned. Rather than risk open battle with him, one of the warlords captured Seljuk's son, hoping that without a leader, the band would fragment and break away. It was a good plan. The thing about these steppe confederations, hordes, whatever you want to call them, the bands that held them together were very loose. More often than not, it was a single charismatic, powerful man who brought them together. And once he died or stopped providing them with plunder, the warriors dispersed and went their separate ways. When Seljuk's son was in prison, this is no doubt what his imprisoners thought would happen. But into the power vacuum stepped Tughril and Chaghri, nephews of the imprisoned war chief. The two men harboured a strong desire to avenge their unjustly imprisoned uncle, yet an even stronger aspiration drove them: to lead. Amidst the ever-changing allegiances of the Asian steppe, 2 brothers and their burgeoning army, perhaps now 2,000 strong, began to operate as mercenaries, taking payment from petty war chiefs to join them in combat. They fought well, but always seemed to pick the wrong side. In a single brutal conflict, the 2 brothers faced disaster. Utterly outnumbered and outfought, the Seljuks were slaughtered. Both Tughril and Chaghri barely escaped the battlefield with their lives. Pursued relentlessly by the vengeful blades of steppe chieftains, they rode until their horses could no longer bear them. Marked men, they knew they could no longer stay where they were, and leaving behind their family and animals, spirited south with only the most loyal followers in tow. By the time they reached the Zagros Mountains, only the toughest and most determined remained. Half dead and starving, the tiny band trudged over the first mountain range they'd ever encountered. As they journeyed through the foothills, they encountered prosperity and wealth beyond their wildest dreams. Every family they passed, no matter how poor, were well-dressed and well-fed. The men here were fat, and the women beautiful and powdered. The brothers had crossed into the land of the Ghaznavids. The Ghaznavids were a local power with roots in both Persia and the Asian steppe. Think of them as steppe warriors with a sprinkling of Persian sophistication. To the exhausted Turkic brothers, their strange, brightly coloured mosques, abundant fields and hilly terrain seemed alien. Even the religion the Ghaznavids practiced, though still Islam, was a world away from the basic rituals they'd performed on the steppe. But there was little opportunity to admire the magnificence of the landscape. The Seljuks found themselves in an incredibly dire situation. Exhausted, sick, and impoverished, their worn-out bows and starving horses hardly spoke to their prowess as warriors. Writing to the Ghaznavid governor, they begged for protection. Quote, "If the Sultan sees fit, he will accept us as his servants, so that one of us will pay homage to him at his exalted court, and the other will undertake whatever service the Sultan commands, and we will rest in his great shadow. He should grant us the province of Nasa and Farawa, which is on the edge of the desert, so that we can put down our possessions and rest. We will not allow any evildoer from Mount Bakan, Dihistan, the borders of Khwarezm, and the banks of the Oxus to appear, and we will fight the Iraqi and Khwarezman Turkmen. If, God forbid, the Sultan does not agree, we do not know what will happen, for we have nowhere else to go." The two brothers made their mark on the bottom of the letter and prayed. Their followers were few and thinning out by the day, and their families long lost back in Jand. If the Sultan refused them, it was the end of the line for the House of Seljuk. Their plea soon made it to the desk of the Ghaznavid Sultan, a man named Masoud, who was himself descended from Turkic people, just like Tughril I Chaghri. Masoud's grandfather, the founder of his kingdom, had been a Turkic slave, a Mamluk, and his success had stemmed from settled people underestimating the havoc that a coalition of well-led steppe warriors could wreak. Therefore, he could think of nothing worse than inviting these untamable vagabonds to guard the northern flank of his realm. His realm was in the grips of a famine. The people were starving, rebellions were frequent, and he was barely holding things together as is. He told Tughril I Chaghri to keep on walking because they weren't settling there. But the two brothers weren't going anywhere. Like vultures circling a dying lion, they could sense that the Ghaznavid realm was on its last legs. Within a year, they twisted the Sultan's arm into giving them the land they requested, just pasture land, they promised. We're simple herdsmen, they insisted. All we want is somewhere to graze our families and live out our days in peace. Unless he wanted another war, Masoud had no choice but to give in. To Tughril went the city of Nisa. Chaghri got Dihistan, both in modern Turkmenistan. The termites were now in the walls. Within mere months, the cities of Khorasan had shifted their allegiance to the Seljuk brothers. The Ghaznavid grip here was so feeble that the shift was little more than a formality. Sultan Masoud had seen it all happening. Everything was going exactly like he knew it would, yet he was powerless to stop it. Gathering his diminishing forces, he launched assaults on the Seljuk strongholds, one after the other. But whenever he gained the upper hand against the brothers, they would retreat and vanish into the unforgiving northern steppe. Surviving on dried curds and suckling warm blood from their horses, the Seljuks would bide their time until the Sultan had left. Civilization had brought Masoud prosperity and influence, but it had dulled the edge of his grandfather's generation. His soldiers could not and would not venture into the steppe to pursue the Seljuks. On the 23rd of May, 1040, a mere 5 years had passed since a fateful letter had landed on Masoud's desk, and his empire had all but crumbled. Near the modern city of Merv in Turkmenistan, the exhausted and starving army of the Ghaznavids prepared for their final stand against Tughril I Chaghri. The once fertile and green countryside was now a barren wasteland. Masoud's secret weapon, his Indian war elephants, must have been swaying from hunger, with their riders scarcely in better condition. It had been death by 1,000 cuts for his army. In every engagement, the Seljuks had had the upper hand. There was no defeating them, only delaying them. The termites had spread to every supporting structure of his empire, and it was now so weak that one final push was all it would take to bring it down. His army fought well and bravely, but the outcome was already decided. Tughril I Chaghri vanquished the Ghaznavid army. Sultan Masoud fled to India and was murdered only a few weeks later by his own men. The Seljuks had torn apart their first realm. After a lifetime of struggle, they'd finally landed on a winning strategy. Masoud and his Ghaznavids were the first in a long line of crippled kingdoms that would eventually lead the Seljuks to the hallowed walls of the Roman Empire.
Shopify grows your business no matter how far or big you grow. Shopify is the global commerce platform that helps you sell at every stage of your business. Whether you're selling your fans' next favorite shirt or an exclusive piece of podcast merch, Shopify helps you sell everywhere. Shopify powers 10% of all e-commerce in the US. Allbirds, Rothy's, Brooklinen, and millions of other entrepreneurs of every size across 175 countries. Plus, Shopify's award-winning help is there to support your success every step of the way. Because businesses that grow, grow with Shopify. Sign up for a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/income, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/income now to grow your business, no matter what stage you're in.
When you need mealtime inspiration, it's worth shopping Baker's, where you'll find over 30,000 mouth-watering choices that excite your inner foodie. And no matter what tasty choice you make, you'll enjoy our everyday low prices, plus extra ways to save, like digital coupons worth over $600 each week. You can also save up to $1 off per gallon at the pump with fuel points. More savings and more inspiring flavors make shopping Baker's worth it every time. Baker's, fresh for everyone. Fuel restrictions apply.
The lightning speed collapse of the Ghaznavid kingdom should have been a wake-up call to the petty rulers of Iran. These two brothers, these Seljuks, were tougher, smarter, and more focused than your run-of-the-mill steppe warriors. But old feuds and grudges are hard to forget. More often than not, the brothers again found themselves employed as mercenaries in the local squabbles near and around Iran. Once they had money and manpower, that same winning strategy they'd used on the Ghaznavids was repeated. First to fall were the remnants of the Dalamites, the old rivals of the Ghaznavids. After them were the Kurds, soundly defeated and chased back into their mountain fortresses. They would cause no further trouble for the Seljuks. It was around this time you could say that the Seljuk horde took its first steps into becoming the Seljuk Empire. While many contemporary sources write with tears about the horrors of being subjected to these, quote, barely Islamicized barbarians, it's worth remembering many of these cities had been in a perpetual state of war for over a century. Usually, Tughril I Chaghri opted to keep the state apparatus in place. As long as the cities they conquered paid their taxes, the peace they enforced brought a sense of stability that hadn't been felt in this region for years. Clearly, there were those that welcomed their new overlords, as evident by Khorasan poet Nasir-i Khusro, a contemporary who blasted his fellow townsfolk for accepting Seljuk rule lying down. In one of his poems he wrote, quote, "Why are you deceived by the rule of the Turk? Remember the glory and strength of Mahmud of Zavulistan?" He means the Ghaznavids. With their realm growing bigger by the day, the two brothers' goals took them in different directions. There are only scant references to this period, but it seems as if Chaghri wished to continue the well-trodden path of a steppe warlord, sacking, burning, looting, and partying. But Tughril had eclipsed that. He began to take the first steps towards true state building. After over a decade of overthrowing rival dynasties, he wanted to establish his own. Soon, Tughril's usual demands of a conquered people, cash and hostages, came with an additional one: for his name to be read aloud in Friday prayers at the mosques. When the brothers conquered Nishapur in 1038, Tughril forbid his army from looting the city until the holy month of Ramadan had concluded. And once the date passed, he still refused to allow the customary looting his warriors were so used to. Moves like this raised his piety across the Islamic world, but he was playing with fire. Tughril may have experienced a spiritual awakening, but his warriors' loyalty to him was the sole factor keeping him in power, and denying them their coveted loot was a surefire way to incite rebellion. When Chaghri, whose men had also participated in the siege, found out about this, he was furious. The two brothers almost came to blows when Chaghri refused to order his men to stand down, but Tughril in a rage spat that he would kill him if he dared. The brothers were moving in different directions. With the Seljuk realm growing so rapidly, they seem to have agreed to divide it up. Chaghri got the eastern provinces and slowly falls off the historical record. Tughril got the western provinces, and it's around this time that his name starts to appear in Roman correspondence. Coins bearing Tughril's name soon began to filter through the grubby hands of merchants in Constantinople. For Tughril to be minting his own coins was a sure sign of his lofty ambitions. A new, formidable neighbour was setting up on the edge of Roman territory, steppe archers organised into an empire. And it wouldn't be long before the two entities would overlap. By the mid-1040s, Tughril had a problem. His plans for statecraft had hit a snag. The Friday prayers at every mosque were commenced in his honour, He had viziers, government departments, and recognition from the Caliph himself. But the fact of the matter was, he was a Khan, a warlord, the leader of a fairly unruly nomadic horde. And the warriors that kept him in power expected him to behave like one. The duty of a war chief was, above all, to provide pasture land for the cattle of his followers. And we're not talking about a few goats and a bag of chickens. According to A.C.S. Peacock, author of The Great Seljuk Empire, each Turkmen may have owned over 100 sheep, each, let alone cows, donkeys, or horses. That meant when Tughril conquered Nishapur in 1038, his 3,000-man army could have had 300,000 sheep trailing behind them. That is a lot of sheep that need a lot of grass. Christian chronicler Bar Habrals tells us of how these enormous herds became like locusts to the drought-ridden region, quote, "In every place where his troops meet together, they plunder and destroy and kill. No one district is able to support them for more than 1 week because of their vast number, and from the sheer necessity they are compelled to depart to another quarter in order to find food for themselves and their beasts." How was Tughril to cement the foundations of statecraft, law, and taxation while his troops ate their way through his empire like tourists at a free buffet? The answer was simple enough: send them elsewhere. But where? As another horrified vassal of Tughril watched his ravenous army devour his winter possessions, he made a bold suggestion to the war chief, quote, "My territories are too small for you and to support your needs. The best thing is to go attack Anatolia, to fight in God's path, plunder, and I will come in your wake and assist you." Anatolia, sometimes called Asia Minor as a part of modern Turkey, would have been well known to Tughril. A sweeping plateau of green pasturelands crisscrossed with rivers, the vassal king spoke true. Anatolia would be perfect. But guarding it were the Romans. The bulwark of the East, the Roman Empire, was a far greater foe than any emir or princeling that Tughril had vanquished. Even in the golden years of the early caliphates, the great Arab armies, blessed by the Prophet himself, had not managed to conquer this ancient land. A war against Rome would not be an easy one, and Tughril, now moving into his senior years, had no wish to destabilise the recently won heartland of his empire with a long, hard campaign into foreign lands. But he knew someone that did. Since splitting the Seljuk realm, relations between Tughril and Chaghri seem to have been frosty at best. There was little contact between the brothers, but when their realms of influence crossed, they would both nominate governors to plot against the other. It seemed they passively worked to undermine the other, which might explain the appearance of Chaghri's son sniffing around Tughril's territory. So, at long last, 30 minutes into this episode, we introduce Muhammad bin Dawood Chaghri, soon to be known as Alp Arslan, the heroic lion. Alp Arslan was probably born in 1029, meaning by this point of the story he would have been in his late teens. He would have been old enough to remember the bad old days as his father and uncle struggled to make ends meet. Out of Chaghri's 10 or so children, Alp Arslan is mentioned the most frequently, indicating his favouritism or skill. It's fair to assume he would have accompanied his father on numerous campaigns, and he seems to have been a natural fit as a commander. While the physical and psychological traits of Chaghri and Tughril are vague, Alp Arslan steps from the history books in vivid colour. According to Rashid al-Din, a Muslim statesman writing about 200 years after this time, Alp Arslan had a commanding presence that inspired others just by being near him. He was consistently focused and attentive, causing foreign emissaries to tremble in his presence as he seemed to perceive their true intentions. He was tall and carried himself with grace, but the most distinctive feature was his incredibly long mustaches, which he tied behind his head when firing arrows, which, according to Rash al-Din, always found their mark. While his father, Chaghri, treated Islam as a means to an end, Alp Arslan was said to be incredibly pious. Although he appreciated a good glass of wine, Alp Arslan was deeply committed to Islam, consistently keeping an Islamic judge, well versed in Sharia law, by his side at all times, even in battle. His uncle Tughril knew a rival when he saw one, and it seems likely that he pushed Alp Arslan to begin his raids west. Let the Romans deal with him. With any luck, he won't return. But return he did, and with each successful raid, the young leader's reputation grew. The perfect blend of Islamic piety and raw Turkic power, he was like nothing that had been seen in Byzantium. As we saw in the last episode, the Byzantine response to these rumblings in the east was weak to non-existent. The Roman Empire was spiralling. Basil II's hard-won conquests of the past few centuries were protected only by a sparse network of fortresses, which Alp Arslan and his raiders slipped right past. The thumping that Tughril hoped his troublesome nephew would get never came. Instead, Alp Arslan returned across the border, laden with cartloads of treasure and miles of slaves. By 1055, Tughril found himself compelled to enlist the aid of his popular nephew to quell a revolt in Baghdad. A humbling experience for the warlord. The young, stronger lion encircled its proud, elderly uncle. Chaghri died in 1059 and Tughril followed him a few years later. Though another candidate was raised up for succession, Alp Arslan swatted away his half-brother like a fly. For the first time, the great Seljuk Empire stretched from modern Iraq to Tajikistan, and there was no doubt as to who would lead it. The gates of heaven's wrath opened upon our land. Numerous troops moved forth from Turkestan. Their horses were as fleet as eagles, with hooves as solid as rock. Well girded, their bows were taut, their arrows sharp. They shot arrows like lions, and like lion cubs they mercilessly threw the corpses of many people to the carnivorous beasts and birds. God poured his wrath down upon us by the means of a foreign people, for we had sinned against him. This was how Armenian historian Aristarchus Lastavirtsi described the destruction of his homeland under the hooves of Alp Arslan and his warriors. The Kingdom of Armenia, which occupies roughly the same area as the modern country of Armenia, was one of a few Christian buffer states that bordered the Byzantine Empire. These semi-independent kingdoms dotted across the Caucasus acted as important barometers for the safety of the Roman heartland. To get to Rome and Anatolia, a hostile power needed to pass through the lands of Armenia, and Alp Arslan had just done that. And not just pass. Armenia had been transformed into a smoking ruin. Ani, a city known as the City of 1001 Churches, had been utterly ruined, with a kind of methodical venom that immediately sent shockwaves back to Constantinople. Alp Arslan's expedition was launched purely to keep his Turkmen rabble happy. His men needed plunder, and if they didn't get it from outside his empire, well, they'd start looking within it. Alp Arslan may have expected that this expedition, like all his others, would be met by a pretty limp response. A threatening letter by some weak-willed emperor whose only motivation was holding onto his head from one day to the next. But he was wrong. Around the same time as Alp Arslan's accession to the throne, the Byzantine Empire got a new emperor. And from the day he took the throne, he drew a line in the sand. His battered empire would no longer be a punching bag for Pechenegs, Normans, or Seljuks. The buck stopped here. His name was Romanos Diogenes, and he took the throne as Emperor Romanos IV. We spent the entirety of this episode following the rise of the Seljuks, so it's time to check back in with the Romans. 13 years had now passed, and time had not been kind to the empire of Caesars. Our last episode ended on the deathbed of Constantine IX. His reign had lasted 12 years, and the energetic emperor had done an adequate job holding the empire together, considering the number of concurrent invasions he faced. After his death, Empress Theodora took over again. The 75-year-old woman ruled for just a year before dying of natural causes. Her death brought the prestigious Macedonian dynasty to an end. The godly bloodline of Basil II was gone. Never again would the Roman Empire be graced by such excellent warriors concurrently. Following her death, her eunuchs raised up another ancient geezer, Michael the Old. The ultimate civilian emperor, Michael further sidelined the military. In the Roman Empire, power flowed from Constantinople, literally. The city was more than a capital, it was the pulsing heart of the empire. Besieging the city was almost impossible thanks to its harbour and enormous walls, and this had led to a robust centralised administration. Fodder, ammunition, and crucially, soldiers' pay came directly from Constantinople. The central government held power which could, and was, distributed and revoked depending on the need. Armies were supplied, sent out to meet a threat, and then dispersed. But in the mid-7th century, a new system was implemented known as the theme system. A theme was a localized militia that worked to defend their territory. The theme system was born out of necessity, as a way to slow down the rapid conquests of Muhammad's armies. Overall, it had achieved what it was meant to do, but now, 400 years later, that threat had passed, and the central government now had to contend with regional commanders who could, and did, act like almost independent warlords within the empire. These men were very influential in their community, usually noblemen or farming magnates. They shared the hardships of their countrymen and served their interests, as opposed to that of some distant courtroom thousands of kilometers away. Some of these men could call up 5,000-10,000 soldiers, and they could, and did, argue back against the central government. The legacy the theme system left behind was a delicate power-sharing arrangement. The emperor could now not as easily force new taxes or levy troops. Now, when his delegates came knocking, powerful men asked, "Yeah, what's in it for me?" before deciding whether to obey their orders. Times had changed, but Emperor Michael the Old couldn't seem to grasp it. Disconnected from the reality of life on the borderlands, he continued to sideline, ignore, and insult his military aristocracy. Contemporary historian Michael Sellos summarizes their frustration, quote, "For a long time the soldiers had found the situation of the state to be intolerable, because the emperor was always chosen from among the other side. When the need arose for some to conduct hard battles and resist adverse fortunes, those who lived in Constantinople could sit back and relax, as if in a great castle, while those who lived far away from the city and the countryside suffered terribly." End quote. You can kind of see why they're annoyed, can't you? They're trying to fight off enemies that are getting craftier and more numerous, while an emperor, some guy they'd barely even heard of a few days ago, thousands of miles away, is swapping out the commanders and giving them nonsense orders. Sellos goes on to say, quote, "For these reasons they were ready to protest against this situation in a most violent manner, and they lacked only a spark to set off their explosion." And then it happened. During the festival of Easter in 1057, the most influential figures of the empire were summoned to the capital to receive their yearly salary. Everyone who was anyone was there. Dressed in their finest silks, they waited patiently in the beautiful Hagia Sophia church for the inauguration speech of the emperor. It was on these occasions they could look forward to an acclamation, a new title, or maybe even a promotion. But as the aged emperor stalked out into the glistening halls, it was clear that none of these would be forthcoming. According to Michael Sellos, almost every military commander there was dressed down for his failings. The emperor barely had a kind word to say between them, but it was when he reached a man named Isaac Komnenos that he really blew up. In front of everyone, he unleashed a torrent of abuse at Isaac Komnenos, blaming him for nearly every one of the emperor's recent failings. He declared that he had corrupted the army and stolen funds set aside for the population. When his fellow commanders attempted to defend their colleague, the emperor told them to shut up and kept the abuse coming. He ranted that Komnenos had shown no signs of gallantry or leadership, and that he'd used the army as a vessel to enrich himself and win glory. When he'd finally finished, Komnenos stood silent, stunned. He had come expecting a promotion and instead had been humiliated and insulted in front of everyone. The aristocracy left soon afterwards, incredulous at the way they'd been treated. It should be no surprise that barely a few months later, a group of disgruntled soldiers conveyed at the residence of Isaac Komnenos. They were there with a singular purpose, to raise the commander as a new emperor. The rebellion had already begun, and these men were as good as dead if they didn't succeed. We don't know if Komnenos wanted to be emperor, but when an army of cagey veteran soldiers rocks up at your door, you can't exactly turn them away. Komnenos was a good bet. Bred from aristocratic stock, his father had been a close confidant of the godly Basil II back in the glory days of the empire. He was level-headed in battle, and most importantly, he was a military man, one of them. Isaac Komnenos was hailed emperor by his mob. The rebellion was short and bloody. Roughly matched in size and training, the two Roman armies met at the Battle of Hades. Roman slew Roman in the first of many, many civil wars that would soon become synonymous with the spiraling Byzantine Empire. By the end of the year, Isaac Komnenos sat on the throne of Byzantium as the new emperor. Crucial to his rise had been Patriarch Michael Coralius. If you'll remember in our last episode, Coralius was the outspoken Patriarch of Constantinople who had been, at least partially, responsible for the great schism between the East and West Church. Corellius had been around for almost as long as the wall paint inside the Hagia Sophia, and absolutely revelled in yet another opportunity to play kingmaker and assert his position above the emperor. But Isaac Komnenos immediately made it clear that he wouldn't be a puppet to the patriarch, the court eunuchs, or even the military, the ones that put him there. Komnenos took the throne with an agenda, and that was to fix Rome. For decades, he'd sat on the sidelines bemoaning the moronic decisions made by distant palace emperors. Now he had his chance to fix it, and he wasn't going to mess it up. Dark, brooding, and laconic, on his coins we see the 59-year-old standing tall, hand on the hilt of his sword, ready for a fight. That sword first slashed through the voluntary gifts past emperors had paid. There was no money for that. Next, it came down on the bloated state salaries given to the bureaucrats. Forget it. After, church donations fell into his crosshair, putting him squarely at odds with Patriarch Corellius. As church endowments were cut one by one, the up-jumped patriarch confronted the emperor, reminding him about how much he owed him. The patriarch whispered menacingly into his ear, quote, "I made you, I can unmake you." That was one threat too many, and the emperor moved to have the old windbag sent away. Komnenos soon got him put on trial for treason, and thankfully, away from the spotlight he'd become so accustomed to, the patriarch died of natural causes. The stage was set for a promising rule, but barely a year later, Komnenos fell into a fever and died soon after. He left the throne with the most woefully inept ruler we'll meet in this series, Constantine Ducas, crowned as Constantine X. It's fair to say that imperial power had stalled up to this point, but Constantine X slams that lever into full gear. Here is where the wheels really fall off. His reign is not well sourced. We don't even really know how he got the job, but he was a member of the Ducas family. The Ducas family, much like the Komnenos family, were extremely powerful families that were coming to dominate Byzantium. From this point in the history until the end of the Roman Empire, these families and a few others will always be somewhere close to the reins of power. Their tightly knit clans spent their days scheming on ways to claim the imperial throne. Once they got it, they spent untold sums of money trying to keep the other families down. And, as we'll see at Manzikert, they were more than happy to throw the empire into turmoil if it meant they were the rulers of whatever was left. Constantine X quickly reversed most of the previous emperor's budget tightening measures. Gifts, salaries, church donations, he brought them all back. When his advisors asked where he'd get the money from, he probably shrugged and gestured vaguely towards the army. Just as Alp Arslan was ramping up his raids in the east, Constantine X stood down further units. It also seemed like he reduced the maintenance for border fortresses, completely disbanded the specialist units near them, and slashed the quality of the equipment the soldiers used. As I said, sources are really spotty at this time, but it seems like Constantine X put all his cards into diplomacy, banking on being able to talk his enemies out of attacking his vulnerable empire. Obviously, he was wrong. In these tumultuous years, the Normans mopped up the last of Roman resistance in southern Italy and circled their very last holdout, the stronghold of Bari, located on the heel of the Italian peninsula. The Roman governors again begged for reinforcements to shore up their deserting armies, but Constantine X had nothing to give. The throne room was in chaos, as his overpaid, underqualified courtiers received news of a new sultan in the east. Alp Arslan and his forces had just sacked Ani. The city of 1001 churches was a major trading hub in Armenia that had been officially annexed by Rome about 20 years ago. Boasting huge walls and backed up against a quick-flowing river, the city was thought to be impregnable. Alp Arslan's sophisticated use of tunnels and battering rams proved to any doubters that his band of Seljuks were a far greater threat than some ragtag bunch of horse archers. 12th century historian Matthew of Edessa tells us how Alp Arslan entered his city. Quote, "All the troops of the impious ones had sharp daggers, one in each of their two hands and one held in between their teeth. In this manner they generally began to destroy the city mercilessly, cutting down such a multitude of people in the city that it was as though they were mowing green grass, piling up bodies one on top of the other as if they were throwing rocks onto a heap. In a moment the entire city billowed in blood. All the grand princes of the house of the Armenians and the ranks of the Azats stood before the Sultan in iron chains. Countless, numberless, bright-faced boys and charming girls were taken along with their mothers. Many blessed priests were buried alive, while others had their skin flayed from their bodies from head to toe. He then goes on to say, the silver cross the size of a man, which they had thrown down, they took and put it under the threshold of the door of the mosque in the city of Nakhchivan to be stepped on, where it remains to this day.
This is the story of the one. As a maintenance engineer, he hears things differently. To the untrained ear, everything on his shop floor might sound fine, but he can hear gears grinding or a belt slipping. So he steps in to fix the problem at hand before it gets out of hand. And he knows Grainger's got the right product he needs to get the job done, which is music to his ears. Call, click Grainger.com, or just stop by. Grainger, for the ones who get it done.
I'm Ken Harbaugh, host of Burn the Boats from Evergreen Podcasts. I interview political leaders and influencers, folks like award-winning journalist Soledad O'Brien and conservative columnist Bill Kristol, about the choices they confront when failure is not an option. I won't agree with everyone I talk to, but I respect anyone who believes in something enough to risk everything for it. Because history belongs to those willing to burn the boats. Episodes are out every other week wherever you get your podcasts.
The fall of Ani was a disaster, but for whatever reason, Constantine X did nothing. Historians are at a bit of a loss as to why. I mean, he was pushed on all fronts, sure, but this was a major incursion into Roman lands. Armenia held strategic importance as the gateway to Anatolia, where the empire sourced much of its food and reared all of its horses. Unlike their outposts in southern Italy, this region was not expendable. Historian Anthony Caldelas speculates whether the emperor, who was known for his piety, might have viewed the disaster as some form of divine retribution. Ani had only recently been annexed by the Roman Empire, about 20 years prior, and its population adhered to a different form of Christianity, which the Roman clergy disdained. Did the emperor leave this incursion unchecked because he interpreted it as God's justice? Divine retribution or not, Alp Arslan's bold incursion confirmed to him that the empire was weak and that it could be exploited for his personal gain. While focusing on his main rival, the Fatimid Caliphate, he now knew he could deploy his more aggressive soldiers into Byzantium to sow discord. As the Roman Empire spiraled, Alp Arslan continued his uncle's legacy, doing all he could to legitimize himself as an enlightened Islamic emir. A key figure in his success was his vizier, Nizam al-Mulk. Nizam al-Mulk is widely celebrated for his contributions to Islamic statecraft, earning him the title the most important statesman in Islamic history. Al-Mulk had been a person of importance under the reign of Tughril, but it was under Alp Arslan where he really starts to shine. An early system of Islamic feudalism, known as the Iqta, had been growing in popularity in the last century or so. It was, at a basic level, the right to levy taxes from inhabitants on a specific plot of land. Al-Mulk gave this policy a Seljuk twist by granting pockets of recently conquered land to prominent Seljuk figures, be they brothers or cousins of Alp Arslan or esteemed Seljuk chiefs. He intricately linked each of them to a parcel of newly conquered territory, binding them to Alp Arslan with a golden leash of tax collection privileges. It was a clever move because he was seamlessly replacing one volatile stream of income with a more reliable one. To keep the money flowing into their pockets, all these princelings needed to do was make sure their fief was peaceful and keep Alp Arslan on the throne. Al-Mulk also came up with the madrasa education system, which still remains widespread in the Islamic world today. With such a brilliant statesman at home, Alp Arslan had free rein to campaign ruthlessly. Shia, Christian, or pagan, there seemed to be none that could stand against him and his Seljuks. But with the coming of the new year in 1068, that easy plunder came to a halt. Rome had a new emperor, and not some Nancy boy bureaucrat or toothless octogenarian, but a real military emperor. And immediately it was clear things were about to change. Sickly and old, Constantine X died in May 1067. The treasury was near empty, the borders had collapsed, and the army was demobilized and demoralized. So what was the last thing the emperor did? exact a deathbed promise from his young wife not to marry. His widow, Eudokia, reluctantly agreed, but once the emperor had died, she began the new search for a husband immediately. The new church patriarch deliberated on whether to allow a new marriage. After all, she did promise, but eventually he reneged, realizing that such a decision would, quote, contribute to the destruction of the Roman Empire. This was the endgame. Things were desperate. So desperate that the usual rigroll of palace emperors, court eunuchs, favourites and pretenders were all skipped. Everyone knew it. They needed someone who could hold a sword. There was only one man for the job. Romanos IV had royal blood on his mother's side and a famous general on his father's side. He had devoted his life to soldiering, actively engaging in frontline combat as an akriti, a border soldier. The akriti were renowned as the toughest of the tough, representing the remaining core of what had once been an invincible army under Basil II. The empire's borderlands were perilous, and the akriti who inhabited these territories became legendary figures. Their heroic deeds inspired songs that patriotic Greeks still sing to this day. Romanos IV was firm and disciplined in his own life and expected the same of his soldiers. When he caught one of his soldiers stealing a donkey, he had the man's nose cut off. He was harsh, bordering on severe, but so were the times, and it's not hard to imagine a miniature shrine to Basil II sitting in the emperor's chapel. Like the great man himself, he made it clear that his reign would be dedicated to a singular purpose: to restore the tarnished glory of Rome. His contemporary, Michael Attaliates, said of him simply, quote, one thing alone satisfied him, that he marched against his foes. But jumping on the imperial throne wasn't as easy as just marrying in. Constantine X had left not just a widow, but a son, and though the royal court might have been willing to let the empress's vow of celibacy slide, it was much harder to remove a legitimate heir. So as a kind of compromise, Romanos IV agreed to make Constantine X's son his co-emperor. But it didn't stop there. With the son came two younger brothers. Having already been elevated as co-emperors and junior emperors by their father, Romanos couldn't exactly strip them of those titles either without causing ripples. So this gaggle of hangers-on was the new ruling family. Looking at a coin from this period, it makes it clear how crowded the throne was. On a single coin, there were now 6 figures: Romanos IV, his wife, Jesus Christ, and 3 of Constantine X's sons. Why am I harping on about this? Because, as I mentioned before, all of these men were members of one ultra-influential family, a family that was as petty, vengeful, and vindictive as they were wealthy, the Ducas family. And Romanos IV was now surrounded by them. The family's deep entrenchment in the court added significant complexity to the emperor's role. While some members of the Ducas clan may have reluctantly accepted the need of having a true soldier emperor for the greater good of the Roman world, one did not: Andronicus Ducas. We have no physical descriptions for this man, but if you need someone to picture in your mind, conjure up Littlefinger from Game of Thrones. Because it was this man, perhaps sneering from the back of the emperor's coronation, who would ultimately bear responsible for the impending disaster that would soon befall the Roman Empire. Romanos soon realised that he had his work cut out for him. Things in the capital were not the same as the borderlands. Endless bureaucracy hampered his ability to react quickly, and over-the-top ceremonies sapped energy that could have been spent planning campaigns. The relationship with his wife was also a source of stress. The empress seemed to believe that because she had raised him to this position, he was subservient to her. Romanos saw things differently. How he became emperor was now irrelevant. Now that he was in control, there was only one thing on his mind: reconquest. As soon as he could, Romanos assembled an army and marched east. The emperor was well aware of what was required: a massive display of force to instill fear against the Seljuks. With a few skirmishes and sackings, Romanos aimed to deter the Seljuks from venturing into Roman territory in the upcoming campaigning season. Escaping the buzzing intrigue and plotting of the Ducas faction in Constantinople, the fresh country air and the sounds of marching boots must have offered a sense of relief as the imperial army headed east. Marching behind him was the largest eastern army in almost 2 decades. One could almost believe that the elite army of old Basil II had returned. But if you looked a little closer, well, here's a quote from a contemporary who watched as the procession marched by, quote, It was something to see the famous units and their commanders now composed of just a few men, and these bent over by poverty and lacking proper weapons and war horses. For long they had been neglected, since no emperor had gone on an expedition to the east in many years, and they had not received their allotted money for supplies. Decades of neglect now reared its ugly head, and the emperor knew it. Romanos could not change the past, but he did everything he could to drill the army and inspire a sense of pride in his men. He wanted them to feel as he did when he fought for his empire and his god. Northern Syria was the first to feel the crush of imperial boots once again. Made up of small, mostly Arab principalities, the Seljuk hold here was weak, and any emirs that had recently switched loyalties were dealt with harshly. Hierapolis, modern-day Manbij, in northern Syria, was the first test for his demoralised army, and with the guiding hand of Romanos, they performed well. As the campaigning season drew to a close, Romanos debated whether to march on to the strategically vital city of Aleppo, but ultimately decided against it, realising his army was too inexperienced for such an expedition. The army returned to Constantinople in January 1069. Despite some setbacks, the expedition had been largely successful. Trust and confidence in the imperial throne had been restored, and morale among the troops had gradually improved. Most importantly, Alp Arslan had been put on notice. Any aggression against Rome would be met with a fierce response. While it was a promising start, the emperor understood that instilling fear in the Seljuks would require sustained effort over many years. Maintaining a constant presence of elite troops in the east was neither feasible or cost-effective. If only there were a corps of elite soldiers ready to guard the frontier. And of course, there were. The Normans. Roger Crispin was a Norman captain who had just finished up his service in southern Spain. With more than a few victories against the Moors under his belt, perhaps Romanos figured that he was motivated by some kind of religious zeal, a different breed to the other Normans he dealt with in southern Italy. But no. Crispin and his company were sent to the borderlands, and almost as soon as they got there, rebelled against the emperor and began terrorizing and extorting the locals. Crispin employed the time-tested Norman strategy: answer a call for assistance, cause chaos, defend the area from the ruler who originally requested your service, wait for that ruler to tire of the conflict and acknowledge you as their vassal, rinse and repeat. Crispin entrenched himself effectively, defeating 5 Roman armies sent to capture him. It was only when Romanos himself marched out, flanked by his fearsome Viking bodyguards, that Crispin finally surrendered. Even after Crispin's arrest, the countryside saw little improvement. His leaderless followers resorted to banditry and continued to terrorize citizens in smaller villages. As usual, the decision to hire Normans always seemed so tantalizing. For just a few thousand gold pieces, an elite foreign army will demolish your enemy and everything will be back to normal. But it never turned out to be that straightforward. For the next 2 years, Romanos' military campaigns continued, but none had the same results as the first. He rebuilt fortifications in the borderlands and did what he could with the army, but in the capital there were problems. Drowning in a sea of Ducas family members, Romanos had cozied up to the other major influential family, the Komnenos. You might remember the promising but short-lived reign of Isaac Komnenos from earlier. Marrying his son to an influential Komnenos baroness, Romanos ran the risk of upsetting the Ducas family, but he had few other options. He needed some muscle in the capital, and without a counterweight to the Ducai, he was vulnerable. As we'll see, it would prove too little, too late. Numerous expeditions were sent out west, but Alp Arslan now had learnt to parry and predict these counterattacks. His raiders could disappear quickly in a puff of smoke, and the sluggish Roman army had no way of following them. In the year 1070, he raided all the way to the city of Colossae, only a few hundred miles south of Constantinople itself. Fear gripped the citizens of the capital as they heard of the sacking of the city, of infidel hordes hacking apart the famous statue of Archangel Michael and butchering the townsfolk that had gathered beneath his holy feet. 2 years into Romanos' rule, and things had only got worse. The Seljuks had grown bolder and were raiding even deeper than before. If nothing was done, they would soon be at the gates of Constantinople itself. Romanos had to do something, and he had in front of him 2 options. More conservative advisors insisted that they should fall back to the old defensible lines, give up Basil II's conquest and leave Armenia to its fate. But his younger, more fiery councillors insisted he go big. a huge show of force to send these vermin back to where they came from. Romanus, a career soldier who was used to military solutions, went for the latter. Standing in his council chambers, the emperor scanned the map of his withering empire. His finger traced the rivers and mountains until it fell on the recently fallen fortress of Manzikert. And on that cliffhanger is where we leave it for today. In 2 weeks, we've got the battle itself, so make sure you're subscribed. As ever, thanks to our generous patrons, and a big shout out to our Justinian tier members: Angus, Claudia, Doug, John H, John K, Sam, Sarah, Seth, and Tom. Cheers, guys.
Hello, this is Gary Chahot welcoming you to check out the French History Podcast. Our main show covers the history of France from the first humans until present. If you liked Mike Duncan's The History of Rome and wanted a similar program covering the land of beauty, culture, and love, we are exactly that. We also host world-renowned scholars who have delivered guest episodes on their specialties, including 18th century pirates, revolutionary booksellers in 20th century Paris, the special friendship between the Marquis de Lafayette and Thomas Jefferson, and numerous others. Learn what you love and listen to the French History Podcast today.
Coming up on 5 Minute News, I'm Anthony Davis. You might think it's partisan because maybe it's critical of one side or the other, but it's not, it's just the truth. And I think that's also something that's kind of unusual for Americans listening to the radio or to podcasts, because the news landscape in the States has been so partisan for so many decades. So 5 Minute News is verified, truthful, independent, unbiased, and essential world news daily.